New York ain't New York anymore. How I miss those old pals of mine.
If you could ride along in a Humvee with one of America's most admired combat leaders of the last half century, somebody who helped build the all-volunteer force after the terrible tragedies of Vietnam, what would you hope to learn from him? We'll join just such a man, that very man, and absorb his wisdom in just a minute. But first, hello history lovers and welcome. I'm your host, Dean Carianis, and this is the History Author Show on iHeartRadio, and a special tip of the cap to everybody enjoying today's time travel adventure via our YouTube channel. You can find me at historyauthor.com or across social media platforms. Over 250 interviews, by the way, there at historyauthor.com. You're sure to find one that's right for you. Plus, you can read my columns in the New York Sun to get my analysis of current events through the lens of all I've learned from these books on the shelves behind me. Please do check out my columns. Please do check out historyauthor.com. But I am not here to plug things. I am here to share somebody we are welcoming aboard in our time machine for this episode. This is an internationally acclaimed author. He's a military historian and a U.S. Army veteran, Mike Guardia. You may remember him. We last caught up with Mike to discuss his book, Skybreak, the 58th Fighter Squadron in Desert Storm. That's the first Iraq War, for those of you kids out there who weren't old enough to remember it. Mike returns to discuss his acclaimed bio of Lieutenant General Hal Moore. It's titled Hal Moore, A Soldier Once and Always. Mike Guardia served 6 years on active duty as an armor officer, and he got to know his subject, whose leadership you may recall from the Mel Gibson movie, We Were Soldiers, because Lieutenant General Moore invited Mike into his home and shared so much about his amazing life. Please do visit our guest at mikeguardia.com or on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. That last name is spelled Guardia. Okay, now that we've arrived back at boot camp, let's join Mike Guardia and meet a transformative American military leader, Hal Moore, a soldier once and always. And here we are with Mike Guardia. He's going to chat with us about his book, Hal Moore, A Soldier Once and Always. Welcome back to the History Author Show, Mike.
Hey, Dean, it's always great to be here. Thanks so much for having me on the program again.
Well, the sign of a good author is one that once you read one of their books, you want to read all of their books. And that was certainly the case with you after we talked about Skybreak. And I've gotten to know you a little bit through Twitter and through our interview. So here you wrote a book about somebody that is fascinating. And I knew you'd bring really important talents to it. And also as a veteran yourself, and thank you for your service. I knew that you'd bring more than a journalist might bring. That not that we don't do great jobs, but I knew that this would be good on this interesting man. Now, most of us are familiar with him from the movie about Hal Moore, We Were Soldiers Once, starring Mel Gibson. And usually a book follows the film. In your case, the film starts you on this journey to writing Hal Moore, A Soldier Once and Always. So let's start there. Bring us to the movie theater. What happens that brings you on the path to this great book?
All righty. Okay, so let's see. We will wind the clocks all the way back to March 1st of 2002. And I was one of the lucky people in the audience to see We Were Soldiers on opening night. And I remember when I saw the trailer for the film, I said, wow, you know what? This looks like a really interesting war picture. And to that point, I had no idea who Hal Moore was. And I only had a very passing familiarity with the actual Battle of Ia Drang, and had kind of a macro concept of what the Central Highlands campaign was. But here I was, this 18-year-old boy who was sitting in the audience. And from start to finish, Dean, I got to tell you, the film just absolutely blew me away, because here was the first picture that I had ever seen to portray the Vietnam veteran in a positive light. Because when I think back to all of the Vietnam pictures that I had seen to that point, they all had one tying theme together. And it was that they all pretty much universally portrayed the Vietnam veteran in a completely negative light. I mean, it was always someone who was mentally unstable, someone who was malicious, and someone who I think by every conceivable standard was really a misfit in modern society. We all know the popular depictions of Lieutenant Dan, right? So
Rambo.
Right. And here was the first picture that I had ever seen that didn't have any type of political agenda. It didn't have any type of social agenda. It was really just an honest and a very intimate portrayal of a lot of these stout-hearted men who went overseas to fight for their country, and how they started off with a lot of popular support at home, but you saw a very, very quick erosion of that support as time went on. So, you really had men who were fighting an uphill battle. They were fighting a war that they weren't necessarily trained to fight. And I was just blown away by how well Mel Gibson had portrayed Hal Moore throughout the film. And I was determined at that point to learn as much as I could about him. So it was following the film's release, and it was over those ensuing years that I read the book, We Were Soldiers Once and Young. And then I also read the follow-up to it, We Are Soldiers Still. And then I went looking for a full-on biography of Hal Moore himself, and I was shocked that there was none out there. I was like, somebody's had to have jumped on it by this point. I mean, this guy has done a lot. The footage that we saw in We Were Soldiers is just, one little cross section of a wider story arc of, him influencing positive change and being also being a tremendous combat leader. So when I found out that there was no biography out there on him, that's when I decided to pick up the task and start writing it.
And I'm always happy when the right biographer finds the right subject, because to me, sometimes, honestly, I'll have people pitch me a book and I don't think they did a great job with it, or they just don't want to talk about it. They don't want to promote it. And I say, if you're going to write a book about somebody like Hal Moore, don't write it just for other academics. Don't just say, well, I'm above promoting it and talking about it on a show like this. Go leave it in the woods, because then nobody else can really write that book. A publisher's not going to want to publish another book right away on it. So I was very glad that you brought it up, and that the movie concept is a thread that runs through today's interview, because I found when I was reading my questions in preparation for this conversation that I said, gee, I mentioned the films and movies in Hollywood a lot. And you do that at the very beginning of Hal Moore, A Soldier Once and Always. As you said, you show him, and you had one picture that goes with something you were just saying, and that's Lieutenant General Moore's promotion to Brigadier General in 1968. He's surrounded by his family. Mm-hmm. And you can't think of anything that's more unlike the portrayal in an Oliver Stone type, just really a hateful two-dimensional film. Every one of them, as you said, is some kind of broken, reprobate human being. And this is carried even through to the current day. I'm sure veterans go for a job, and I have a friend who is an Iraq veteran. He says, I go on the job and they're worried. They ask me about PTSD and are you going to fall apart? And they're afraid I'm going to shoot up the office. And that's from films like this. So this picture of Hal Moore as a family man, you got to know his family, you got to know him. So tell us, who was he as a family man, and how does that debunk this idea that these fellows just never were able, any of them, to leave the war behind, and they brought it home with them?
Mm-hmm. He was an incredible family man. At pretty much every turn, every interview that we had, and every one of his associates and every one of his family members that I spoke with, they were all very quick to tell me that he does not fit any of the stereotypical archetypes of what you would expect in a military officer. That he is incredibly kind-hearted, that he is very family oriented, and he saw his role as a commander in any one of the units that he led as a facilitator of sorts, to make sure that all of the soldiers know that they are within a family environment, and that the families they bring into the unit are co-equals in creating this 360-degree family environment. And you really see that start to shine through when he took battalion command, because you see throughout the film, and you also see throughout many of the literature that Hal Moore produced himself, that his wife Julie took it upon herself to be a leader among the military spouses, as almost as a point of light, to say, hey, I know that being a military spouse is an incredibly rough job, and I know that there's a very good argument to be made that being a military spouse is actually the toughest job in the military. So you have an advocate in me as the commander's wife, and I will take it upon myself to make sure that we have babysitting co-ops, to make sure that we have support groups, so that all of the women that are left behind when the soldiers go off to war are adequately taken care of. And they have this support system in place among the fellow wives, particularly for any spouses who are miles away from their immediate family, or whose other immediate family members have passed on. So, you really get a sense of compassion, and you get this overarching sense of a commitment to family values and to making sure that every one of his subordinates know that they are more than just a number, that they are more than just a name, that both he and Julie are taking an active role in their welfare and their overall developments as a human being. So, I mean, that just like flies in the face of, all of these nasty Hollywood stereotypes of, some coked out guy who's high on PTSD.
And I remember that scene where he's afraid it's the telegram telling her husband is dead. And the poor guy is just asking for an address. Right. And he's shaking, and he's so sorry that he's terrified her. Mm-hmm. And instead of, as you said, having one of those breakdowns and being just a stereotype, she says, let's go deliver them together. And she leaves her house, right? They go door to door. And she is the one who helps comfort her now widow, but her fellow military wives. And that's the kind of thing that you get from Hal Moore, from your biography here, because he is a real person, and he rings true throughout your bio. So it's something that I think we're hungry for without realizing it, I guess you'd say. When you've seen a million movies and you've absorbed a million things from Vietnam, there was a column I wrote, I think in the Washington Times, and I said how when Peggy Noonan read one of the accounts that was later proven to be false, the guy had never been to Iraq. I think he'd washed out of basic training. And she said, when I was reading his account of atrocities and the whole media was running with it, and this is horrible, she said, I started to think this is not real. This is a Vietnam movie. This is a Hollywood version of what our soldiers are like and what happens in war. And she was right. Her instincts were right. The guy turned out to be false. So I like to start with somebody who is going to be honest with me. And you certainly are here. As you were saying about the film, you had no agenda. So that's really a compliment, and you must feel so satisfied you were able to bring that picture of somebody, especially since you got to know Hal Moore.
Absolutely. That is, it will always be one of the biggest honors of my life.
Lieutenant General Moore, he graduates from West Point in 1945, and that's the year World War II ends. And you can't imagine a time that's more of a dichotomy, right? Here we're talking about the stereotype of the Vietnam soldier as this broken, horrible person, maybe dangerous at the worst, but broken at the very least. And then you have this Pax Americana. The United States stands athwart the world as a colossus after World War II. And that's when Hal Moore gets his start. So he sees a lot of change in his life, also sees combat in the Korean War, which is often called the Forgotten War because it's doesn't have those big set pieces. I would argue it shouldn't be forgotten. So take us back to that beginning. How does being a soldier in the ranks in 1945 help Hal Moore develop into the leader he became? And how does he manage to change over the years so that he can adapt through the Vietnam conflict when things do change so much? As you said, that's not the war they were trained to fight.
Exactly. So he really went into it with, I can only say, a lot of mixed feelings because, he was really counting on fighting in World War II and then is approaching his final year at the academy. Well, then all of a sudden the threat from the Axis powers goes away. So, he comes into what is now qualitatively a post-war world, and he's saying to himself, well, gosh, I really think that I've missed the big one. Here was this colossal enemy that we were all pretty much training to fight against, and it's gone out the window now. And, now we have become an army of combat to an army of occupation. And I really don't think that that's something that the military is geared for. I was really counting on fighting the Japanese. I was counting on fighting the Germans. And there's probably never going to be there's probably never going to be another war for as long as I'm in uniform. Gosh, I've missed the big one. So he came into it with a little bit of disappointment, but at the same time, he was telling himself, well, I know what type of enemy that I was training to fight against. I know the atrocities of which the Japanese were capable, and I know the fanaticism that a lot of those Japanese soldiers had. So there's probably a good chance that I would have been killed if I jumped into combat against the Japanese, because at that time we were preparing for an invasion of the Japanese mainland, and the everyday Japanese, for their part, they were also preparing for that. You had them starting to dig trenches along the beaches of Honshu, and you even had Japanese civilians being issued pitchforks to attack incoming paratroopers. So it was almost guaranteed to be a bloodbath. And he said, in that sense, I was a little bit relieved because, I'd personally known upperclassmen who were killed in action. But now that we are no longer an army of combat and we are now an army of occupation, this gives me a front row seat to learn how to deal with all of the indigenous populations. This is really one of the first times in modern history that we go into a peacekeeping role, because here we are, we have this enemy that has been defeated, and we are now an army of occupation who is committed to building good ties with the local communities, and who is committed to trying to rebuild the people who just a few months ago we were calling our enemies. So for me, as Hal Moore, I see this as a crash course in how to build ties with all of the local citizens. This is going to help me when I get into Vietnam, because this is a war where we're all about winning hearts and minds, and we're trying to build good relationships with all of the local hamlets and try to build these partnerships with the South Vietnamese as a counterfoil against the rising insurgency that we see with the Viet Cong. So that initial tour of duty that he has on the Army of Occupation, it is really incredible, and you see the downstream effects of it when he's in Vietnam, because that gives him it really gives him the solid intellectual foundation to know how to be in equal parts a war fighter and also a man of the people. And then if you fast forward just 5 years later, from 1945 into 1950, suddenly it was the war that we never saw coming. It was the war that we certainly didn't expect, but everyone who missed out in combat in World War II now suddenly has a chance to prove themselves on the battlefields of North Korea. And even still, this is also something that shapes his outlook in Vietnam, because it's not really a war in the traditional sense. It's called a police action. There's been no formal declaration of hostilities, and you have a limited scope of what you're trying to accomplish. You're hamstrung by a lot of rules of engagement that tend to discourage initiative instead of promoting it. And he has to learn how to operate within this environment, and has to say, okay, well, if the higher echelon leadership doesn't quite have the fire in their belly for victory that other, that our other political leaders and other military leaders have had, well, how can I affect positive change, and how can I affect victory at the lowest level, at my level, and still come away with meeting as many tactical objectives as I can. And that is exactly what he pulled off in the battlefields of North Korea, because he was saying to himself, okay, well, I have to stem the tide of communist aggression, and I have to stop it in its tracks, while still being mindful of, okay, well, this is where my operational area ends. Here's where it begins. I can't go beyond these perimeters, and I can't do items X, Y, and Z, even though I think they would produce better downstream effects than the ABC list that I've currently been given. So when you take those two factors together, the so-called limited war in Korea and the what we can only call a Johnny on the spot peacekeeping mission in occupied Japan, those really set the intellectual foundations for him to become a very effective commander in Vietnam.
You said something there in passing about how he's disappointed that he doesn't get to see the elephant, is the way they called it in the Great War in World War I, that he doesn't get to see combat. And that's another thing that jumps out at me, because in these films that we grew up seeing, I'm older than you, but all those Vietnam movies, we've all seen the same ones, right? And I remember the first film I saw, and I think it was John Milius's Rough Riders, which I love. It's a great, and listening to the commentary track is even funnier, because he puts Germans in there, and he says, well, you need to have the Nazis in a war. And then he says, oh, they're not Nazis, right? They're just happen to be Germans. And there were no Germans in Cuba. There's a bunch of mistakes like that in there that are really irritating, but it is a fun, very interesting movie. I would encourage everyone to check out Rough Riders. But there's a soldier there that gets wounded, and they say, well, that's you're going home with that one. And he's disappointed. He says, "Oh gosh," because they wanted to show what he was made of, and that's something about Hal Moore. And it doesn't make him the warmonger, which is another trope from those Vietnam movies. But he wants to defend his country against enemies that are legitimately trying to destroy his country and are trying to get back to those women that are there on that base and try to kill them too. So it's really a high calling that Hal Moore had, wasn't it?
It sure was. It sure was. That was actually one of the things that he kept tying back into through a lot of the interviews that I had with him. It's really a dichotomy of sorts, because you hate war, yet you train for it. And even though you don't love it, you see it as a necessary evil, because, sometimes when the chips are down and the odds are stacked against you, you need to have a cadre of rough and ready men who are at all times ready to defend the call of freedom. So, yeah.
Yeah, I love that about this book. Again, it's Hal Moore, a soldier once and always. You talk there about Vietnam and World War II, and the movie We Were Soldiers, and that only covers that one battle in one war in this life that he has, where he has many duties. And I wanted to ask you quickly, if a Hollywood studio came to you and said, "Hey, we want to do another movie of Lieutenant General Moore's life," what items spring to you? What set pieces, what part of his life would you like to see portrayed on the big screen, just as well as they were portrayed in that Mel Gibson movie? So we got a sense of, here's a moment of time in his life.
Right, exactly. Okay, so let's see. If I had to boil it down to one set piece, I would try to focus on all of the major items that he did in trying to rebuild the Army from the post-Vietnam malaise, because I think Hollywood has given a lot of attention to Vietnam proper, and the way that they've portrayed it has always been a little bit stilted. So I think, okay, well, if we take We Were Soldiers as a data point, and we're to say, okay, well, here is the tipping point to where we start portraying the Vietnam veteran in what we can call a positive light now, instead of what we saw in like Apocalypse Now and Full Metal Jacket and Platoon and all those other war films. Well, let's take it one step further, and let's see how the Army actually rebuilt itself from the darkest days of Vietnam. Let's see what happened in 1973 onwards, where you had the Army that was collectively at its lowest ebb, and you had you had this lingering public backlash against the military, and you also had a survey of public confidence in where the Army ranked only above sanitation workers in a survey that showed how Americans collectively thought of their institutions. So if we take that as a foundation, let's go ahead and make a follow-on movie about Hal Moore to say how he did everything he could to reverse those trends. How he said, okay, well, if we have a country that by every conceivable standard hates the military, one, how do we attract new recruits, given that we're going to an all-volunteer force? How do we make the Army marketable, and how do we make the individual soldier proud? Because if he's coming into the military, he wants to be in the best shape of his life. He wants to have confidence in what he's doing. He wants to have confidence in his leadership. And he also wants to have confidence that when he goes home on leave, or when he travels out and about, if people know he's a soldier, he's not going to be met with that hostility. So that movie would include all of the little bits and pieces that Hal Moore did to essentially make that a reality. How he revamped the training programs, how when he was the base commander at Fort Ord, he went out of his way to make these long-lasting community programs to build good relationships with people who were in the cities of San Francisco and all of the surrounding communities that make up that Fort Ord military community. So that, I think, would really tie in with the broader theme of, hey, we want to try to portray the Vietnam veteran in a positive light, but let's also see how the military rebuilt itself and recalibrated itself and turned how it turned from the post-Vietnam rabble into the high-tech professional fighting force that won Desert Storm in Panama.
Also worth reflecting on the other movie portrayals. And as you're talking about Hal Moore and about that post-Vietnam period, I'm thinking the only movie to really cast the new Army, which is a cover of one of the fake Newsweek covers, magazine covers, was Stripes, and it's a comedy,
Right.
right? It's starring
Right.
Bill Murray, who's nobody's idea of a soldier, right? But he's the
Right.
only one. That's the only film that portrayed this transition to the all volunteer force. So, if anyone from Hollywood's listening out there, here we go. You have to give Mike Guardia a call about Hal Moore because it is hard. It's not easy. It doesn't just become the military that you're speaking about there of the 1980s, where they reinvest and the Ronald Reagan military reassociate with that, and with the destruction of foes. It is a tough transition. So he has a front row seat in this, Hal Moore.
He sure does. He sure does. And I really got to hand it to him. I mean, I have to credit him with so much that he did to revamp the Army. And as I was going through all of the documents and even a lot of the personal papers that he had, I was able to trace a lot of different points of instruction that I had been through as a soldier to the ideas that he put down on paper. And, so it for me was incredibly satisfying. And in a way, it was also coming full circle to see that a lot of the training experiences that I had as a brand new soldier were things that I could directly trace to Hal Moore, and a lot of the concepts that he said, okay, well, if we're going to rebuild the Army, here's what we got to do. We got to start with these.
The whole thing is incredible. Your whole book, I would encourage people to pick it up because we can only touch the surface. Hopefully we're whetting their appetites, but you look at what he accomplished in those years and how much change there really was. Another big change is we have the desegregation of the military on General Eisenhower's advice, and then President Truman carries that out. And there's this great movement, speaking of set piece battles, I think everyone at home can picture this. There's that moment in May of 1970. There are race riots breaking out in a U.S. Army base in South Korea, and they call Hal Moore, which is just a great moment. There's the beginning of your film, right? And I wanted to ask you, tell everybody, what's his rank at the time? Why do they send him to deal with this problem, with this race riot? And then the great detail is, who does he find hiding under a desk when he arrives there amid all this chaos and takes charge?
Oh, man. And Dean, I got to tell you, this is something that is like straight out of a movie script. So
there you go.
If we were to wind the clocks back to May of 1970. So here's Hal Moore. He is at the time a 1-star general, and he's on the 2-star list, and he's working at the 8th Army headquarters in Korea. And at this time, he already has a solid reputation behind him. I mean, all of the stuff that he did in Vietnam, it has really become the stuff of legend within the Army. He is well known throughout all the military circles. People see him as a go-to guy. If you have a problem and you want it fixed, you got to try to find Hal Moore. And if you don't have Hal Moore, try to find somebody who's close to him, because this guy can deconstruct a problem, and he has the velvet glove. He can motivate people in ways that many other leaders cannot. At the time, he's a 1-star on the 2-star list. He's working in the G3 operations cell for the 8th Army. And he has a notoriously tough boss. His name is General John Michaelis, who, who I think in many ways was the modern day incarnation of Patton, because, he was such a hard charging SOB. He was known for having exacting standards, and he would not think twice to relieve anybody of duty if they even made the slightest mistake. So he had a tremendous amount of confidence in Hal Moore, and the fact that Moore lasted as long under General Michaelis as he did, I think is just amazing. But it's this night in May where all the phones at the operations center start blowing up, because apparently there's some big conflict that's happening up along the DMZ. And at first they say, okay, well, all these phones are blowing up. They wouldn't be coming in with all these urgent messages, and we wouldn't be seeing these things across the teletype if there wasn't something bad happening. And there's this muted sense like, oh my God, is this the start of the Second Korean War? Are these North Korean agents starting to infiltrate the DMZ? What is going on? But then they start to get a bigger picture, and they say, okay, it's an enemy of an entirely different kind. Racism is rearing its ugly head across all of these camps that are scattered along the DMZ. You have these race riots. You have this major brawl that is erupting amongst Black soldiers, white soldiers, and Hispanic soldiers. And it is going all throughout the night. And it is getting so bad that the local MPs at all of these army camps are having to call on the Korean police for help. You have soldiers getting knifed, you have soldiers getting beaten up, you have soldiers getting thrown out of second-story windows. And if that's not bad enough, you have millions of dollars in property damage. You have mess halls and libraries that are going up in flames. People are setting cars on fire. It's every stereotypical.
Yeah, there you go. Every stereotype you were getting there. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, that's good. But yeah, I mean, it is like every stereotypical image of all of the urban riots that we see in Hollywood films, and and it is just an all-out mess. So we fast forward to like about 5 or 6 in the morning, where Hal Moore has had a very unpleasant night. He's going through all these reports, he's fielding all these calls, and then he gets a call on the swap box, from the secretary that says, General Michaelis would like to see you. And Hal Moore doesn't think anything of it at the time. He's like, okay, maybe the boss wants a sit rep, maybe he wants an update. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to tell him exactly what is happening and how I understand it. So he reports to Michaelis, and Michaelis tells him probably the last thing that he expected to hear. He says, Moore, we got problems up there on the DMZ. We got problems in the 7th Division. I've already relieved the division commander. So what I need you to do is very simple. And he says this, and I'll apologize ahead of time because I'm just using this as a quote. There's a little bit of profanity in here, but he says, Moore, I need you to get up there and I need you to straighten out that goddamn division. And so Moore, very dutifully, he says, yes, sir. I would be glad to. When do I leave? And Michaelis says, in half an hour. There's already a Jeep outside waiting for you. So yes, within the span of only 30 minutes, Moore gathers up as many items as he can, goes out to the Jeep that's waiting for him. He drives up to the DMZ. Buildings are still on fire. There's blood all over the streets. He goes up to the command office where the 7th ID commander is. And oddly enough, the commander of the 7th Infantry Division, which is the division that's stationed there along the DMZ, that division commander is no joke, hiding under his desk. And Moore just very deftly goes in. He looks around for a little bit. He's like, okay, is the division commander here? But he hears some rustling under the desk. Moore goes around the desk front, looks underneath the desk and says, hi, I'm Hal Moore. I'm your replacement. You out. And yeah, that is the start of where Hal Moore essentially becomes the savior of the 7th Infantry Division. He takes over command, and he just turns that division around like it was nobody's business. Within 1 year, all of the racial and disciplinary problems had essentially disappeared. And also to top that off, they won a number of awards for their readiness, and also for their professionalism. And it was just an incredible transformation that started with Hal Moore taking command from a commander who was hiding under his desk.
Not even in wartime, just
Right.
From his own men misbehaving. You're enjoying my conversation with Mike Guardia. He's the author of Hal Moore, A Soldier Once and Always. It is a great story with many turnarounds, just like that one in it. And who doesn't love that kind of? Think of the movie Stand By Me. Think of all those great inspiring stories where you have people who are beset by infighting, who are never going to win the big game. And that's what you're going to find. Hal Moore was the coach that's able to do that. He does what happens in Miracle, right? Turns around the U.S. team, takes a bunch of amateurs and beats those Reds, beats the Red Army. That's what you get from this great biography. You can visit our guest at mikeguardia.com or find him on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Armchair General writes of the book, Moore, one of America's most distinguished soldiers, granted Guardia numerous interviews and allowed the author unrestricted access to his collected letters, documents, and never before published photographs to produce this first ever fully illustrated biography. Mike, folks watching via YouTube are seeing some of those photographs that you were kind enough to share with me after Hal Moore's family was kind enough to share them with you. You walk in, they're so generous with documents and pictures. I imagine it was such a pleasant surprise for you as an author, but also a little overwhelming. And then you have to meet the man himself. And you are, I'm sure, in awe of him as anybody
Of
would have been.
course.
As you said, one of the great honors of your life, right?
Mhm.
What's it like when you sit down with him the first time? You tell him, here's little me, I'm writing a book on you, sir. And you have a job to do, but you're also still probably that young kid who saw that movie and is blown away by the guy. So how do you do that? How do you approach him and go about writing Hal Moore, a soldier once and always, with the help of this titanic figure? How does he sense in you? I mean, a leader is a leader, right? A soldier once and
Right.
always. He knows how to help you do your job as well, which is a great help for a journalist or for an author. So how does that happen? How do those meetings go?
Oh, wow. It was an incredible experience. And it was also a little bit of a nerve-wracking process. See, I actually got the idea to start writing the book where about the spring of 2009. And at this particular point, Hal Moore, he of course, was still with us. And it was with a little bit of trepidation that I was approaching the project, because I was telling myself, okay, here I am. I am a brand new second lieutenant on active duty, and I have been bitten by the good idea fairy to write this book about Hal Moore, who is a retired 3-star general. So this was also right around the time that I was completing work on my first book, which was called American Guerrilla. So I said, okay, well, now that I have one book down, I really, really want to dive into this biography on Hal Moore, but how do I approach the man? So what I did is I was able to get his contact information, found out that he lived in Auburn, Alabama. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, well, he's probably had quite a few people approach him for the idea of a biography. And, he's probably done a lot of interviews and many other venues. What is it that is going to separate me from the crowd? So what I did is first I approached him with a letter that I sent via certified mail, no less. Probably the mark of a misguided overachiever there, but I wanted to make sure he got it. And it was throughout that letter that I said, hi, my name is Second Lieutenant Guardia, and I would really like the opportunity to write a book about you. As a young officer myself, I've been inspired by a lot of your achievements. I've recently finished my first manuscript, and I would very much love to dive into a potential biography on you. And I sent that letter, and I think about 2 weeks went by, did not hear from him at all. So I decided that I was going to push my luck a little bit and actually call him on the phone, which I did. So he answers, hello. And I introduced myself. I said, hi, sir. I am Lieutenant Guardia. I was the young man who wrote you the letter a few weeks ago. Is there any chance that I could have the opportunity to write your biography? And the first time he told me no. He said it
Wow.
in what I can only describe as the most diplomatic manner. He said, well,
That's
son,
nice.
I really appreciate your kind words, but at this point in my life, I really don't take visitors anymore. But if you want to write anything about me, you sure can. And if you need any bits of information, I'll go ahead and send you some stuff. Well, I may have been a young know-nothing lieutenant, but even at that point, I was still smart enough to read between the lines. It was his very nice way of saying, hey, kid, get lost. So I let the matter drop for about 1.5 years. And then at around that time, I was on orders to go to Fort Bliss in Texas. And for some reason, and I still can't pinpoint why, there was this nagging voice in the back of my head that said, Mike, you have to try one more time. Just try again. Try and approach him a second time. And then if he says no, then, fine. So what I ended up doing at that point was, now that my first book had come out, I had, I took a copy of that first book. I sent him another letter that included the book. And I said, hi, sir, it's me. I'm not sure if you remember, but we spoke about 1.5 years ago. And that correspondence that I sent again went unanswered for about 2 weeks. And then I made the brave decision to call him again. And now I have to emphasize for everyone in the audience that this is an Army lieutenant who is calling a 3-star general. Typically, when you do that, you're asking for trouble. And I half expected to get the butt chewing of a lifetime, but his response when I called him was a 180-degree turn. He said, "Yeah, Mike, I got your letter. What time do you want to come over?" And I said,
Wow.
"Well, sir, I am actually not in Alabama right now." He said, "Oh, okay, well, that's no problem. So what time do you want to come visit me?" I said, "Well, sir, as I will accommodate any time in your schedule." And he said, "Yeah, sure, okay. Well, anytime you want to come visit me, Mike, I'm happy to help you." I was like, I didn't ask questions. I didn't ask him why. I didn't know what changed his mind. I didn't care. I was just like, man, I am going to spike that ball into the end zone. So what I decided to do at that point, now that I finally had that window of opportunity, I really wanted to make contact with his family, and this was fortuitous because Hal Moore's two of his sons are Army officers. They're of course retired now, but his youngest son Dave was still on active duty at the time, and his son Dave was a full bird colonel on active duty, and being that he was an active duty officer, as I was able to look up his military email in the global address system and send him a note. And I introduced myself and said, "Sir, my name is Lieutenant Guardia. I've recently been in contact with your father. I've already written one book. I would very much like to do a biography on your dad." And he emails me back that same day. He says, "Mike, I see you're at Fort Bliss. I'm at Fort Bliss right now on a temporary assignment. Let's meet up tonight. Let's talk about this." I'm just thinking, man, talk about all the stars and planets aligning right at the same time. So I met up with Dave Moore that night, out in El Paso. And we spent, I think we spent a good 2 or 3 hours talking about how we would facilitate the biography and how we would facilitate actually meeting him. And it was just beyond incredible, because it was about 6 months after that initial meeting with Dave Moore that, I was able to take leave from the Army to travel out to Auburn, Alabama, and, in conjunction with his youngest son, set up a series of interviews. And I got to spend probably a good week or so with Hal Moore at his home in Auburn, just going through pictures, going through documents, and just hearing all the incredible stories that he had to share. So it was just a remarkable experience, one that I think I can attribute to a little bit of perseverance and also a little bit of luck. But, in all the sit-down interviews that I had with him, even though I was awestruck throughout every single one of those interviews, what really struck me the most, I think, was just how incredibly down to earth he is. That you see, this man who is a great leader, who, is able to deconstruct problems like pretty much no one you've ever met, is still at the end of the day just a regular guy like you and me, and is one who could very easily be your next door neighbor, and one who is just all around pleasant to talk to. I mean, it's being able to get along with Hal Moore, I have to say it's almost as easy as breathing.
That's great. It's such a testimony to him, and such a blessing, not just for you as an author, but also for your readers, because I want to stress to people listening who maybe aren't interested in conflict, maybe don't have anybody in their family that served in living memory, because now we do have that all volunteer force. It's not like it was after the Great War, or certainly the Civil War or World War II, where everybody had somebody in their family who was either a veteran or unfortunately was lost in the war. You describe Lieutenant General Hal Moore's leadership in your book, Hal Moore as Soldier Once and Always. And that's the reason that I say this book has applications for everybody, whatever field you're in. And that's why we read history, really, right? We don't just read it necessarily for stories. We read it whether we know it or not, because we want to learn a little bit from that and be able to apply those lessons. There are so many lessons in Hal Moore's life, and you lecture on those, and you talk about his leadership style, the way he was able to put you at ease. You didn't even realize, I'm sure, well, you probably were aware of it, but still, you meet somebody like that, they're leading you, even if it's not, hey, go storm that bunker. They're leading
Right.
you because they want to accomplish their ends as well. They want to bring out the best in you. It's an instinct for somebody like Hal Moore. So I wanted to ask you, if there's if there's the moment that demonstrates how you walk into a situation and command it, a lesson that you will hopefully be giving people here, I'm sure people will absorb from reading your biography, but also from when you lecture about Hal Moore. What is that moment, or what are those moments, if there's more than one, that when he walks into a situation and finds a general cowering under his desk, which is not too far off from what a lot of us might face when we enter a new job? What are those moments? What are those lessons from Hal Moore, briefly, that people will absorb from your book and from your lectures on Hal Moore?
Sure. So let's see. I think there are probably two moments that I can pinpoint. One is when he was a brand new second lieutenant, and when he was taking over his first platoon, because here you have 1945. Here is a young, fresh-faced 23-year-old lieutenant who is fresh out of West Point, who has never seen combat a day in his life, and he's going over to occupy Japan. He's taking over a platoon of these hardcore paratroopers, many of whom have seen combat throughout a lot of the worst meat grinder battles in the Pacific, and they have combat experience that is just head and shoulders over anything that this young lieutenant can imagine. And he has to stand in front of these men, who have won Purple Hearts, who have won Silver Stars, who are wearing the coveted wreaths of the Combat Infantryman badge, and he has to gain their respect. He has to go in front of these distinguished combat veterans and say, hi, I am 23-year-old so-and-so, fresh out of West Point, and I am your leader. I have to tell you what to do. To be in that kind of situation is got to be daunting as all get out, because you're like, how are these guys going to take me seriously? So how he handled that was, just his overall mentality of, when you're in charge, take charge, but always treat your subordinates with respect and dignity, because, how you build rapport with those who you are in charge of is if you treat them like an individual, and you take an active interest in the things that are important to them, and you see them as assets instead of liabilities, and you let them know that as their leader, that you are 100% vested in their safety, and that you care about their development, and that you also care about their welfare, and that you do it without being overbearing and without being intrusive. Because one of the themes that ties all of Hal Moore's leadership lessons together is that you don't motivate people by insulting them. You don't motivate them by being overbearing and trying to be that forceful personality, who rules through fear and metrics and intimidation. And that is something that he carries forward when he takes over his unit in the middle of the Korean War, because here he already has quite a bit of time of service under his belt, but he is taking over a unit that is no joke in the middle of combat. And not only that, he is also taking over a unit that has been suffering from very low morale for quite a long time. And he said years later that, if I have the choice between taking over a good unit or taking over a bad unit, I will take over the bad unit every time, because they have nowhere else to go but up. And he took it as a clarion call, and even as a personal calling, to try and take units that were described as misfits and turn them around, and through through that velvet glove leadership, build their confidence, build their capabilities, and take them from a poor performing unit to a high performing unit. I guess it's pretty much the same setup as the Bad News Bears, except we're putting it in a military context. So yeah.
Universal human truths. That's what we're going to get here. And that's another stereotype that's smashed, that this idea of the screaming general. There was a story recently of a World War II veteran, and he talked about meeting Patton. He was a medic, and he's driving along, and he's in a Jeep, and he has the gun is in front of him, and he says, well, so Patton stops and says, what the heck are you doing with the gun? And he kind of chews him out, tells him he shouldn't be there, because this is a combat role. And then he turns around Patton and he says to him, if you came under attack, what would you do? What would you have done with that gun? And he says, I would have fired it at the enemy, sir. And Patton says, job well done. So he says, okay, here, after he chewed a hunk out of my ass, as you said, then Patton knew. And I think that's something we forget about these generals. We have those two views. Hal Moore is certainly a guy who had that nuance.
Yeah, he sure did. And man, he had it in spades because he knew that you attract more flies with honey than with vinegar.
I want to close with a final question, and that's about Hal Moore passing away in 2017. And he does reconcile with the former enemy, which is another thing that we don't associate with the Vietnam War. In this case, the Vietnamese, he reconciles with them. And those are just great moments to read about in any soldier's story. It makes us feel good about our common humanity. Yeah. And he passes away in 2017. He's just a few days shy of his 95th birthday. We just marked his 100th birthday. To close, I'd like you to make your pitch to everybody at home. One final pitch, I guess. I've been promoting your book, and I think it's great. And people are going to have that little voice, hopefully, in the back of their head that sounds like me telling them, "Go buy Hal Moore, Soldier Once and Always," and you will not be disappointed. But I wanted to ask you, as the author, because you knew the man, you really worked with him on this book. Why should readers, whoever they are, whether they're into the war or not, whether they're in the military or have a military family or not, pick up your biography and meet this man so that they can be enriched by it?
Well, I think any number of readers out there would really enjoy hearing a story about a man who was probably from the most humble of beginnings, and how he took he took that humble upbringing and all of the important life lessons and all the important mannerisms that he learned from growing up in small town America. And he kept a lot of those principles true to himself, and how he was able to how he was able to achieve success in the military, and how he was able to be a leader at multiple echelons and inspire people while not compromising those same hometown values that were instilled in him from a very early age. So I think in the broadest stroke that I can make is that Hal Moore, A Soldier Once and Always, is the story of the American everyman who rises to the occasion and affects positive change wherever he goes, and is able to achieve victory and is able to inspire people despite the fact that he occasionally has to work in a not so friendly political environment. Because I think one of the true measures of a man is how he can inspire people, and how long after he's gone, people remember their interactions with him as being pleasant and being, hey, this is a man who I could always count on, and this is a man who inspired me or taught me something that led me to do something great in my own life. So here you have that little shining point of humanity that we really wish we could we wish we could see in everybody.
Well, Mike Guardia, people can't see that here in your book, Hal Moore, A Soldier Once and Always, something we can all aspire to. Thank you for introducing me today to this great American hero, genuine American hero, and for giving me the chance to share him with everybody out there, give them the opportunity to get to know him, especially if you're a young person out there. If you're young, like Mike was when he first saw that movie, We Were Soldiers, and you say, this kid doesn't have a lot of direction, he could use a role model, or she could use a role model. This is a great book to put into a young person's hand, and they will definitely enjoy it. You were fortunate enough to have gotten to know him. Thanks so much, Mike, for making me feel like I got to know Hal Moore too. I hope everyone will pick up a copy of your book and get to know Hal Moore themselves.
Absolutely, Dean. Well, thank you so much for having me on the show. Always a pleasure.
Again, the book is Hal Moore, A Soldier Once and Always. And as always, you can find the Amazon link to purchase your copy at the historyauthor.com page for this episode. By buying a book through us, you help keep the flux capacitor on our time machine humming like usual. Huge thanks to Mike Guardia for joining us and for introducing everybody to a soldier who may have faded away, but who left behind enduring lessons on leadership and life that still have the power to inspire us today and push us towards delivering our very best. Please do visit our guest at mikeguardia.com or on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And if you enjoyed this conversation, please do subscribe at our YouTube channel for future journeys in the Wayback Machine. You can find me on social media as well, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. Find my previous conversation with Mike Guardia at historyauthor.com or on YouTube. That was a video interview about that book, Skybreak, on Desert Storm and the pilots who were the tip of the spear of liberating Kuwait. That's it for this installment of the History Author Show. I hope you'll join us for our next all-new interview right here on iHeartRadio or wherever you enjoyed this journey into yesterday. Until that next trip into the past together, on behalf of Mike Guardia, thanks so much for time traveling with us today, and have a great week.
We still call it Broadway, but what's in a name? Take it from Georgie, it isn't the same. On the east side, west side, things ain't like before. There are tears in the eyes